So there is a little place behind my house. It's this little spot of grass right where the forest meets the field. And it's become a kind of spiritual practice for me to just go and stand there. And I found that somehow, in some weird way, it has the power to reorient me like a compass and to refuel me in those times when I'm feeling fearful or when I'm feeling overwhelmed or uncertain or when I just am struggling with which way to go. I know that it'll point me the only way that's worth going. I go to that place to remember one evening in August of 2016 when the rain just refused to stop. And the water from the Amite River just began to press against us like a wall, thrusting that little patch of ground deep beneath my feet. And I remember the exact way that water felt, how it just seemed so determined to push me into the woods, along with everything else that it stole from us that day. And I continue to feel that water closing in on me sometimes when I go and I stand there. And for weeks, and really probably even months after that, it just continued to kind of feel like there was a noose around my neck. And I would feel like I was gasping for air. Even as the water receded and the sun came back out, I just wasn't entirely sure that I had made it, because death had come so close to me in that moment that it seemed so possible that it might have reached out and touched me. One thing that I've noticed about trauma and suffering and struggle is that there's a whole lot of internal and external pressure to just kind of package it up into something neat and easy to hold so that we can just get back to the business of moving on and get going forward again, back to normal. And I think that there's somehow an underlying assumption that that's what strength is, our ability to just get back to what we were doing right before everything stopped us short. And I tried really hard to do that for a while, hoping that if I did, I would somehow find myself free from that sense of powerlessness and weakness and smallness that it provoked in me. But is that really what it means to be strong? Forgetting? The way that's revealed to us by Jesus is entirely different than that. Jesus, who instructed his disciples to adopt a habit of gathering around a table to remember the day when death touched him and left him gasping for air. And to remember how he submitted to it in a way that appeared to be the epitome of weakness and powerlessness. And how he hung there, his body broken, his blood poured out until it was finished. And then he descended into hell, returning days later resurrected, but still bearing the scars that were inflicted on him that day. Permanent physical reminders of the death that became the entryway to resurrected life. And we call the meal that he invited us to a feast. A feast that beckons us to remember those moments when we looked up from the flood or the pandemic or from the war or from the funeral and found ourselves feeling utterly lost and utterly forsaken. And we were finally able to feel that distance between ourselves and home, between the hunger within us and a satisfaction that can actually only be met at that feast. And seeing how those things that we had once tried to sustain ourselves with, the things we called comfort or ease or strength or power or authority, how they all failed in light of our recent circumstances. And we realized in that uncomfortable truth that we're really not made to go it alone. We're made for union, communion with God. And each time we descend into that feeling of weakness and powerlessness, and come to the end of our own resources, long enough to bring us to the end of ourselves, we look up, and in the depth of that hell, we find heaven waiting for us on the other end. And sometimes I think that normal is actually the thing that keeps us from that. Normal being that thing that just dangles before us in times of trouble, promising to be the cure of our condition if we can just get back to it. Normal that tempts us to package up our suffering into something neat and easy to hold and to get back to going, so that we don't have to sink too far into the discomfort and the weakness that's felt when we really do descend into hell. Normal, which at times of plenty keeps us so distracted and busy and frankly comfortable that we don't sense our own need. And so we just keep going down this road we've made for ourselves, this road that we think leads us somewhere important or good or worth going. And I'll be completely honest with you, I loved normal before the flood. I loved it. I still actually love normal. I find comfort in it. And I had etched out this little pocket of the world in such a way that very few people could ask very much of me. And that felt comfortable too, because I think beneath the surface, I was so discouraged with the state of the world that I didn't really want to deal with it. I was kind of brokenhearted at what felt like too big of a thing to deal with, that if I could just create a little space where I could forget it, it would be okay. And I really thought, according to the theology that I had at that time, that God was pretty okay with that. I thought that God was kind of this distant being that was mostly uninterested in what I did until the day when I would meet him again somewhere else. And I was a pretty good person, more or less. I didn't do any of the big stuff, so I felt good about that. I read my Bible, I went to church, and I bore the name Christian. But what I wasn't doing was following Jesus. The day I started following Jesus was the day that I decided to go and stand on that little patch of ground. And to let those memories that I thought might kill me wash over me. And to let myself feel that physical draining that came as a result of all of that sorrow and grief and fear and shame and guilt and dismay. Marking me with a newfound sense of weakness and powerlessness, the things I most wanted to resist. But at the bottom of that wasn't defeat as I thought it would be. Instead, it was an unforgettable embrace from the arms of love, and that embrace utterly changed me. It changed my whole perception of God from this distant and far off and disinterested being to one who is present and active and filling the room we're in today, and filling each one of us if we let him. And it's changed everything that I once believed about strength and power and certainty and comfort and life and death. So in today's parable, we hear about this son who leaves home and blows his inheritance on riotous living. And I know that the thing that a lot of people love to do here is to just pick a box and sit in it. Elder son or younger son. But I think what that does to us is leave us looking at something in black and white when it's meant to be seen in color. So for today at least, I want to ask you to join me and look at this story not as an either or a here or there, but as a story that reflects humankind's ongoing rejection of the way that's been made for us by God in the name of making our own way. Because that's the story that we have in the Garden of Eden. That's the story of Israel. That's the story of our church, always, even today. And that's the story of me. And it isn't so much a linear progression of here or there, but really a cycle filled with crossroads where we always have a choice of what we're going to pursue each day. And Jesus in this parable employs a literary style that was very common back then. It's the same style that gave us some of the gems like cutting off your arm or removing your eye that we hear sometimes. He's using extremes to make a point unmistakably clear, and those who were listening to him knew that. And for Israel, a brothel wasn't so much a physical place when he heard it from the prophets. It was rich in symbolism. And the root of that symbolism was that the reality is that we have an ability to choose what we do with the gift of life that we've been given. This storehouse of energy within us, we get to choose what we pour our breath, our energy, our resources, our gifts, our God-given capacity to create life into. And we get to ask of it, are we expending those resources on finite exchanges that do nothing but exploit and diminish? Or are we putting them to good use? At the end of the day, the net yield of a visit to the brothel is negative. And notice that this son is starving to death in a land that matches his condition, which is impoverished and emaciated, because that's the economy of exploitation. That's what happens when our pursuits take us to consume and extract without giving anything back. And because we're made in the image of God as creators, our pursuits make something of the place that we have taken ourselves to. We have the potential to choose diminishment, and that becomes the mark that we leave on the world, creating pockets of death where there could have been life, which is really an excellent way to look at the world today if you turn on the news. This place is famished. That's what we see. We see starvation, literal. We see greed, strife, depression, reactivity, deterioration of communities, marriages, churches, and homes, suicide, hatred, violence. Even our planet is gasping for air. It's dying because of us. And there's this ambient anxiety everywhere because I think deep down we know it. We feel it. We know that we're far from home. But the good news for this son and for us and for humankind and all of creation is that in Christ we've been given a way back again. We aren't stuck, perpetually lost. There's a way that leads back to abundance, back to the eternal feast, where on the other side of this hell that we've created is heaven. Yes, we are still far off, but God is waiting to come out and meet us if only we are willing to turn and seek him with our whole lives. And in his embrace, we find what we need to transform both our hearts and ourselves and the world. Because we are made to be so much more than normal. We're cutting ourselves short when we choose normal. We were made to be the physical place where heaven touches down on earth. And that can be the mark that we leave on this world. So when I was a teenager, I discovered this love I have for training young horses. And I think part of it was the fact that if you think about a horse, there's a whole lot of variations when it comes to a horse. Base case, you have what my husband likes to call pasture ornaments that basically live outside in a field and eat grass and run away from things. And that's what they do. But there's a flip side to a horse where they can be completely transformed through training and trust. And they become these incredibly powerful, graceful, courageous creatures who are able to overcome their flight instinct and become able to navigate difficult obstacles with a stunning display of strength. And when they do this, it's almost as if they need a new name. It's almost as if the animals that are out in the pasture and the animals that are in the ring jumping or racing or doing whatever they're doing are different creatures. And the place where this transformation comes from is a mental and physical state that they learn to enter into called collection. And when they're collected, their entire body is balanced and working together and being actively shaped through subtle communication from the rider's hands. And the horse's focus is sharpened, and all of his once scattered and combustible energy is captured and contained into forward motion that's unbelievably powerful and rhythmic and agile. And from a training perspective, collection is just not possible until a horse is broken. And he drops his head in submission to his rider for the first time. It's a bodily shift that once you feel it, it indicates that the horse's mind has opened to the point where he can actually be trained. Before that, you can ride them, and you can get them to do some things, but you'll never be able to tap into that wealth of power and potential that awaits a horse when it's truly collected. But you can't force that. You have to wait for it. And so that's what a lot of training a horse is just waiting. And you keep your hands really steady and really soft until one day, maybe it's an hour, maybe it's a week, maybe it's a month, they drop into it. And your hands are there to pick them up when it falls. There are some trainers that have no patience for that. And so what they try to do is force that kind of look by tying a horse's head down or by using really sharp and abrasive bits, or just exhausting them to the point where they have no energy left to resist it. But in their haste to engineer an outward display of the right motions, they rob themselves and the horse of all of that potential. They never get that lightness and the power of the real thing. And the horses that are trained according to that method are still just as afraid and reactive as the horses that are out in the field, but I think more so because they're being asked to do different things, hard things, and they know they can't on some level. And I honestly think that's what we see in that elder son. And if you're following along in the devotional guide, I think that's what we see in Eliab, David's brother, where they're hoping that through doing the right actions, doing the right motions, that they're being the thing that they can't be until they actually submit their will. But even for a young horse who's dropped his head, the shift to collection doesn't just happen once. It's not a milestone that they reach, but a place they have to learn to return to again and again and again. And it's not a question of this or that, or either or, but how far from union they really are from their rider at any given time. And at first, it's actually really hard for them to maintain it. They don't have the muscle or the mind. So they have to keep working and gradually increase that collection as they grow able to do it. And slowly, as the horse matures, that place becomes the place where all of his power comes from. And what was once an active submission that he resisted in youthful rebellion, bucking and kicking and rearing and bolting, becomes the place from which all of his strength comes. And the firmness of the rider's hands that once felt so restricting slowly become the steady and reassuring mechanisms through which he finds his confidence to do intimidating things with magnificence and ease. We're invited to move through life with strength that comes from remembering the places that broke us. To learn to stand on the patches of ground where we came to the end of ourselves and to sink into the weakness it provokes in us. Lowering our heads as we remember the hands that met us there, not just individually, but communally. We were once slaves, but God broke us out. We were once wandering in the wilderness, and he brought us through with his mighty hand. We were once plagued, trying to protect land that was infested with giants, and God sent David. And we were once lost, and Jesus came to get us out. And we can live with our heads lowered into those hands, trusting that they will lift us and shape us and transform us and collect us over and over again, so that eventually we become a completely different kind of human, to the point where we almost need a new name. One who reflects a Christ-like form that's empowered through a feast that awaits us at a table set for us by our Lord. May we return to that place always and often in remembrance of him. Amen.